Hello everyone, good morning. Welcome to this webinar on minimising gambling-related harm, as you can see on the screen, contributing to a better understanding of problem gambling in Europe, hosted by VIXIO Gambling Compliance and the European Gaming and Betting Association as part of European Safer Gambling Week 2022. I'm thrilled to be here. It's, I'm sure, going to be a really interesting discussion for eminent academics to discuss the topic. My name is Joe Ewan. I am the Global Managing Editor at VIXIO Gambling Compliance. If you're not familiar with VIXIO, we're a regulatory intelligence service covering the global gambling industry through insights analysis, regulatory research, and data. I look after our global editorial function, which covers the rules and regulations around gambling around the world, which obviously intersects a great deal with responsible gambling and efforts to minimise gambling harm. As I said, 4 speakers with us today: Dr. Margaret Karen, Dr. Mark Griffiths, Professor Sally Gainsbury, and Dr. David Forstrom. We're all going to get into a discussion in short order about the understanding of minimising gambling harm around the world. But before we do get into that discussion, Margaret is first going to present on some of the research she's done in partnership with EGBA on that subject. So I will hand over to you, Margaret.
Okay, thank you very much, Joe.
Margaret, you should have access now.
Yeah, it looks fine. Good morning, everyone, and thank you very much for inviting me to present the findings of the study. This is the study that I carried out for the European Gaming and Betting Association between March and October 2021. And the study that I'm going to briefly outline aimed to identify how European member states measure gambling engagement and problem gambling levels within the jurisdictions, and what similarities and differences exist between different jurisdictions. Now, there are many surveys and many measurements that are carried out in the majority of states, but what we intended to see was the level of systematic nationally sponsored surveys or alternative methods that measures the same elements. We felt that such fact-finding exercise would be beneficial additions to the existing academic research, especially because we approach regulators and other relevant national authorities for the data, and we wanted to ascertain not only what surveys are carried out, but what the actual jurisdictional approaches are. The study also aimed to see whether any jurisdictions have adopted their own definition of gambling-related harm, and whether those have been put on a statutory basis. We also collected data on the latest levels of gambling engagements and problem gambling, but this was essentially mainly for information purposes. Now, as you may have already noticed, I have already used the term problem gambling, and this is important to clarify at the beginning that in the study, in my project, this term is used as an umbrella term that will include problem gambling, pathological gambling, as well as gambling disorders. The reasons we adopted the umbrella term of problem gambling is because there are quite significant differences in how this term is used in different countries and in different literature. And it makes it easier to use it as an umbrella for clarity purposes. But it is important to note that it does not fully represent the various jurisdictional approaches, as countries describe their levels using different terminologies and different points of references. It is also quite important to identify that at the outset, because sometimes this is something that we may be asked or thought of, is that the study was not carried out to identify best practice or to name or shame any countries. It was simply intending as a fact-finding exercise to find out more about the current situation and to essentially start the conversations that we're hopefully going to have today during the panel discussion as to whether the current status quo is optimal or whether something would be beneficial if it changed. So this brings me neatly to the methodology. The study was carried out between March 2021 and February 2022. The length of period for data collection essentially reflects the difficulties of gaining sufficient number of responses from the jurisdiction. Partially, it was probably due to COVID, as in some jurisdictions, the responsibility for the keeping of the data, collecting the data, vests in the relevant ministries of health. Also, because we found it quite difficult to gather responses in the course of the data collections, we also decided to include the United Kingdom, even though the United Kingdom is no longer part of the European Union. But we thought that because it was not so long ago and it carries out a variety of different methods of measurements, then it would be a useful comparison as well. But in any case, at the end, I was able to gather responses from 22 countries. However, 2 had to be excluded because the answers were not complete, and that left me with 20 countries with responses that could have been included, and those were 19 EU member states plus the UK. The data was collected via responses to a short questionnaire that asked the respondents to state what methods the state uses to assess level of gambling engagement and levels of problem gambling, whether they carry out systematic national surveys, or whether they assess it using different methods, whether they adopt any official definition of problem gambling, and whether they adopt any official list of gambling-related harm, and what were the gambling engagement levels and problem gambling levels between 2016 and 2020. Respondents were also asked to comment whether the data allowed them to identify any specific trends in behavior, or in levels of engagements with gambling, or in levels of gambling-related harm. Of those 20 responses, 19 have been provided by the relevant regulatory bodies of those jurisdictions or responsible persons within the relevant governmental department to whom this task was delegated and who are responsible for gambling-related regulations. And only 1 response from France was provided by the French National Gambling Association as opposed to the regulator. In addition to the responses provided, I also looked at what systematic studies were carried out that included the jurisdictions that were included in my project, and I will briefly mention 2 of those shortly. All responses were collated and analyzed to determine similarities and differences. As I have only a limited amount of time today, I will only focus on the high-level findings, but the full findings are of course presented in the full report, and this is available online on both City University of London's website as well as on the EGBA website. That's probably already obvious, but the study was commissioned and fully funded and supported by the European Gaming and Betting Association, but outside these arrangements, there are no other conflict of interest that I would need to disclose. So, looking at the findings, and before going into the main findings of the project itself, I would like to draw your attention to 2 studies that were relatively recently carried out, one of which has been in fact co-authored by one of our today's panel member, Professor Mark Griffiths. But the first one that I'm going to mention was carried out by Williams, Wahlberg and Stevens, and they identified 19 prevalence studies that were carried out between 1998 and 2011. And that was within the jurisdictions that they were included in my project, because overall they carried out a worldwide analysis and they identified significantly more. But what was a very important element of Williams' study was the fact that they carried out standardization exercise that converted the rates of problem gambling levels as measured by the jurisdictions into the rates that would have been if the state used the same methodology and the same screening tools. The second study was carried out by Calado and Mark Griffiths, and they focus on the period between 2000 and 2015, which means that there is a certain overlap, but they identified 31 number of studies from within the European member states and 5 further studies that took place in Great Britain. Of those, 19 studies measured past year gambling engagement, 6 lifetime gambling engagement, and 11 did not measure gambling engagement, but only reported on problem gambling levels. So as we can already see from both of the studies, let's go backwards. Let me just see. Yeah. As we can see from all the studies, it already shows clearly that many national localized surveys are indeed being carried out in many states. And similar finding is actually the starting conclusion of my project as well. My study also demonstrated that all countries that participated in the project aim to measure gambling engagements and problem gambling levels in some form, and they take all this matter and the corresponding consumer protection and social responsibility measures very seriously. Where the complexities and challenges lie is within the differences of methodologies and methods, screening tools and intervals in which those assessments are carried out. But let's start with first things first. So let's start with some of the high-level findings. In terms of the existing studies, I would say that it's quite interesting to note that of the 20 responses, 12 countries specified that they carry out regular, systematic, and nationally sponsored survey at regular intervals. This does not mean that other countries do not carry out surveys, but simply that they may not necessarily be carried out in a prescribed, regular, or nationally mandated manner, but sometimes in this country, those are more surveys undertaken than there are those who may be doing it systematically, but at quite large intervals. I also think that it's quite interesting that the requirement to carry out regular survey has been included as a mandatory legal requirement in primary legislation only in one state. But despite that, many other regulatory bodies included in either secondary regulations or facilitate those independently of national requirements. However, this is pretty much where the similarities end. And this is because almost everything else is very different. The intervals, for example, they vary from as short as quarterly telephone interviews carried out by the gambling commissions in the United Kingdom, annual surveys carried out in the Czech Republic, up to 5 years of intervals between the surveys in Denmark. Other intervals include surveys carried out every 2nd year, every 3 years, every 4 years, so that essentially includes all possible durations between quarterly and 5-year periods. In addition, those intervals, however, remain in flux and they are subject to changes. So, for example, in Denmark, there were 2 previous surveys that were carried out in 2005 and in 2016. But from the current year, 2022, the Danish Gambling Authority plans to introduce regular prevalence surveys to take place every 5 years. Greece carried out its first quantitative study about the features in players' and non-players' behavior only as recently as in 2020. In Spain, the National Edades Survey on drug addiction has been carried out for a long time, but questions on gambling were only added in 2019. Previously, Spain's gambling engagement was measured in 2015 and 2017 by specific studies that were commissioned by its Directorate General for the Regulation of Gambling. Czech Republic carries out 3 separate surveys. 2 of those are taking place annually since 2012, and they are part of their omnibus studies. One is carried out every 4 years as part of the large-scale household survey on substance and addictive behavior since 2008. However, questions on gambling have only been introduced to this survey also in 2012. On the other hand, Sweden carried out its National Public Health Survey annually until 2016, and then the interval changed to every 2nd year. But it also undertakes a 2nd survey, SWELOPS, which is carried out on a special assignment from the government. In the UK, bespoke gambling prevalence studies that were carried up to 2010 were also discontinued and replaced with gambling-related questions that are included in the health surveys for England, Wales, and Scotland. However, in UK, the health surveys are also supplemented by the telephone interviews that are carried out by the Gambling Commission. Only Finland appears to have has a relatively stable reporting system in place that has been established for a long time now, and one that continues in its original form up to the current date. The actual vehicle through which the surveys are carried out also differ. 7 jurisdictions use gambling prevalence surveys or population-based surveys. 3 jurisdictions use health surveys, 2 use health and lifestyle surveys, and others use bespoke measures as well. The reasons why it is significant is because it's not only the screening tools that may potentially produce different level of problem gambling engagements, but also different vehicles which may produce different outcomes. And it has been argued, for example, that health surveys are likely to produce lower levels of problem gambling in comparisons to specific bespoke gambling prevalence surveys. But the levels of actual differences are very difficult or time-consuming to measure. Even those who is considered an adult in this context of the survey differs between the countries. So we are talking here about adult surveys, not children's surveys. But the minimum age to participate in the adult surveys are 15 years old in the Czech Republic, Finland, and Spain, 16 years old in the UK, and then 18 years old in France, Greece, Italy, and Malta. The maximum age also differs sometimes. So the maximum age for inclusion in the survey is 64 years old in Spain, 74 years old in Finland, and 75 years old in France. There are no upper limits in countries like Italy and Malta. So this is already showing that there are huge variations, maybe in nuance, maybe on negligible levels, but they are significant in the sense that they really make it hard to prevent any comparative studies or any comparisons without standardization exercises that would have to be carried out for that purposes. In terms of the other countries who have not reported systematic approach, it doesn't mean that they do not measure gambling engagement or problem gambling levels. It just means that they use it in a different format, or even they may be using surveys, but may not necessarily be in a systematic manner. For example, in Belgium, prevalence studies take place actually more frequently than in some of the countries that reported systematic use of the surveys. And one of the more recent ones included a public health surveys from 2018, and that was carried out by the Federal Research Centre, which is linked to the Belgian Ministry of Health. Also, the Belgian Higher Health Council also reported another study in 2018, carried out by the Flemish Expertise Centre VAT. Now, surveys are also carried out in Italy, Ireland, and Latvia. And in 3 other countries, gambling engagement and problem gambling are estimated by reference to the number of registered players and the number of people who are on the self-exclusion registered. And again, the screening tools also differ. There are jurisdictions which use PGSI, there are jurisdictions which use DSM-4, there are jurisdictions which use NOTS, GSI, LIBET screen, bespoke screening tools, and some jurisdictions use 2 screening mechanisms in the SAFE survey. Now, I'm running out of time, so I'm going to be quite brief. This one is, okay, on the remaining part. And just to highlight that the only country with statutory list of gambling-related harm is Finland, but those are really broad. And in UK, extensive work has been carried out to try to categorize gambling-related harm. But it's interesting to say is that there is no exhaustive definition that has been produced that would be detailed and exhaustive in any of the countries, or none that would be put on a statutory basis. Now, the reasons why it is difficult is because sometimes it is very difficult to have a robust analysis of cost and benefits of gambling if the scope of what we're actually counting in terms of harms, or in fact in terms of benefit, remains fluid. So just briefly to conclude, I would like to say that I myself find it quite difficult to find the robust justification for the present situation. What is commonly advanced as a justification relates to cultural differences, historical difference, jurisdictional priority, and what works in any given jurisdiction. And I accept that those are legitimate reasons. However, sometimes I think that many of those arguments are over-exaggerated. And ultimately, I don't believe that we as human beings are that different. And many of the levels could actually be made in a more similar way that would make it easier to have the conversations about effectiveness of certain measures, and also to discuss as to what is the optimum method of measurement, what is the optimum method of addressing as to what the measurements tell us. After all, there is a pan-European study that assesses levels of various activities in children. So there is already a precedent that it is possible to do so. But I'm sure that there will be many other entirely opposing views on that matter. So for now, I would like to thank you for your attention, apologize for some problems with the slides, but thank you for your listening, and I hope that you have found it interesting enough to look up the full study on the website. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Margaret, and an incredibly good job keeping to time, because I know there's a lot to cover in that. That's deeply appreciated. Great, so we're going to get into our discussion now. For those of you who joined us after my brief introduction, I'll just go over the speakers again. We have, as you've just been hearing, from Dr. Margaret Carron, Associate Professor in Law at City University of London, Dr. Mark Griffiths, Distinguished Professor of Behavioural Addiction at Nottingham Trent, Professor Sally Gainsbury, who's the Director of the Gambling Treatment and Research Clinic at the University of Sydney, and Dr. David Forstrom, an Associate Professor at Uppsala University. So, before I get into my questions, I should say that we would like to answer as many questions as we can from you watching. You should have on your screen somewhere the facility to type in a little question. If you do, that will pop up for me, and I'll try to get to as many of those as I can before we finish. But to start, we'll start at a high-level question, I suppose, and which is, I'm interested in what you see as the biggest issue affecting our understanding of problem gambling right now, and how that kind of echoes through to the way that gambling is regulated and harm minimization is regulated. Simply because this is the order I see on my screen. Mark, if you would mind addressing that first.
Yeah, sure. I mean, obviously, if you ask what the biggest issue, it would depend on whether you're a regulator, whether you're a policymaker, whether you're an academic. I mean, obviously for the industry, affordability is a really big issue at the moment in terms of, regulators want people to be able to afford their gambling. For me specifically, as an academic, the issue has always been about measurement, which is kind of ties in what Margaret is saying. I've been working in this area for 35 years now, and one of the things that is been a debate, but as long as I can remember, is how do you actually assess what problem gambling is in the first place? And we've got big issues and big debates around what harm is in relation to gambling at the moment. We also have to remember, of course, is that a lot of what we're talking about today here, we seem to see gambling in isolation, and gambling is never in isolation. People who are problem gamblers often have more problems with drugs, cigarettes, risky sex, depression, anxiety, you name it. There's lots of other comorbidities going on there. For me, for somebody that spent 3.5 decades in this area, the biggest issue for me is always about how we assess and measure problem gambling. Now, for me, who particularly the last 10 years, we've been doing a lot of work using tracking data. And I suppose one of the biggest issues for me is how we marry up with what people actually do online, and we know what they're doing online very objectively, with what they say they do in surveys, because we know particularly the more problematic you become, the more there is a mismatch between what we see from their tracking data and what they actually say in their survey. I'll leave it there. Lots of issues there. Let's hear what other people have got to say.
Thank you, Mark. David, if you could go next, please.
Sure. I agree with Mark on what he said. One thing that I've been thinking a lot about recently is how you conceive gambling. So in Swedish studies, when asked about scratch cards, for example, people don't conceive that as gambling. So sort of the normalization of gambling and what gambling is for sort of inhabitants in Sweden, and we've had the Swelog study that was briefly mentioned by Margaret that has showed that the number of Swedish gamblers have decreased while the turnover for gambling is still the same, and the number of problem gamblers are also at the same level. So there's been a change in the Swedish gambling market, which is hard to understand and might have something to do about how gambling is conceived by the Swedish population, at least. So for me, that's a big sort of area that I would like to understand more about, and that I see as a problem.
Thank you. Sally, what do you think is the sort of headline issue for you at the moment?
Thanks, Joe. I'll echo what Mark and David have said. For me, it's about understanding harms. This is an issue that has been gaining increased attention, recognising that problem gambling is more than just when we get to the clinical end. And I come from a perspective as a clinical psychologist, but I'm directing of a research clinic as well that works with industry and policy. So as Mark says, it depends on what the issue is. From a clinical point of view, I'd like not to see our clients come in. I'd like to see there be some intervention that is successful in disrupting the journey towards gambling harms, recognising that some people will have gambling harms, but for a lot of people, if there was an appropriate intervention to alter that trajectory. So that's the research I've been looking at, is how can we identify who is at risk? And that also means self-identification. How can we encourage people who are in what we, I suppose, would call an at-risk group to engage with some level of consumer protection or harm minimization tool to keep their gambling at a recreational level, to put safeguards in place? How can we engage with this group before the problems become so severe that the option is to self-exclude and engage with treatment? And from an operator perspective or an industry and policy perspective, how to understand this group of risky individuals without necessarily constraining them or putting in place measures that are not voluntarily adopted, but rather than just waiting for problems to become so severe that now we can safely act on their behalf. So that group of at-risk individuals, how can we come up with better options for who these people are and better options to engage with them?
Okay, thank you. Margaret, I guess we've already heard one of the big issues that you think is affecting understanding of problem gambling right now. So I think I'm going to use that opportunity to move into a different question, which will be for everyone, but Margaret, if I could start with you. Is there sufficient, do you think, agreement among the academic community around understanding what problem gambling is and how it should be measured to help inform policy at this point, or is that still an area of significant disagreement?
I think there are kind of two questions here. One is the one about understanding of problem gambling, and of course, if you think about gambling disorder, that is properly defined. There is a clinical definition of a gambling disorder. Previously, we had a definition of pathological gambling, and I think at broad level there are a lot of understanding, and everyone has a good idea as to what a potential problem gambling may look like or what it may lead to. I think the difficulty comes with the level of details and the actual scope of what we do classify as problem gambling, what we do or do not include. And I think to echo what Sally said in response to the previous question, I think one of the biggest difficulty with the inconsistency with measurement, inconsistencies with what we classify as problem gambling, even sometimes, as David said, inconsistency with what we considered to actually constitute gambling and what people consider constitute gambling, makes it difficult for evidence-based regulation. And I'm not a psychologist, I'm from a law department. So my main interest is how the regulations can help to achieve what Sally's talking about, preventing people from presenting themselves for clinical treatment. But in the absence of consistency in the data and in the understanding of problem gambling, it's very difficult to justify or criticize any of the regulatory responses, which is why I personally think that one of the biggest problems is the lack of consistency in measurement, lack of consistency even within any given jurisdictions over a sufficient long-term period. As I mentioned, there are only some that have had consistent measurements for a long time. So that's what I would say would be kind of the answers to your question.
Anyone else like to come in on academic consistency?
Well, from my perspective, again, I have to look from a long-term perspective. I don't think we've ever had agreement on what is the best way to assess problem gambling. There are over 25 different screens, well, it's probably more than that actually, but there's certainly over 25 different screens out there to assess problem gambling. And we know that when we ask people questions, they do tend to give you socially desirable answers, or there are various memory recall biases, and that's the problem we have with any kind of survey research. And obviously, I've been doing survey research many, many years now, and it's, you know, that'll be here to stay. But I do think it's exciting now that, you know, with things like loyalty cards, player cards, tracking data online, we do have a very new way to look at what people do at the extreme ends of the spectrum now, and it's through that I think we can start to develop new ways to assess problem gambling. So myself and Michael Auer, we've recently developed a new problem gambling behavior instrument that is purely based on what people actually do within their gambling rather than the consequences of gambling. Instead of asking people, you know, have you lied to your therapist, or, you know, do you feel excited and buzzed up when you gamble, which is the kind of things that are consequences of gambling. What we're now getting from the kind of more objective data is we know what people at the extreme ends of the spectrum are doing. So for instance, you know, are you constantly loading your wallet during a playing session? I mean, this is the akin of keeping going to the cash machine when you're at a table kind of thing. You know, are you constantly hitting your limits? You know, these kind of things are what people actually do online. We can actually start to develop, you know, instruments. And the other thing we've always assumed is that all forms of gambling are homogenous. You know, every single screening instrument that we've got, you know, whether you're a lottery player or whether you're a sports bettor or whether you're a slot machine player, you get exactly the same questions. What we have not got at the moment are actually bespoke instruments for specific types of gambling. And, you know, one of the things we also know about gambling at the moment is that the lines between kind of gambling and gaming are starting to be blurred. When we talk about things like loot box buying, is that a form of gambling? Do we need a separate instrument to assess whether people are buying loot boxes? I mean, these debates are not going to go away, but I do think we are living in a golden age of data now. You know, we have got massive big data that really can help academics, help regulators, and even, you know, help in terms of implications for treatment providers and the issues that Sally was talking about. So I do think we have to harness, I mean, although people have said technology has made gambling worse, I actually think technology can be harnessed to both help gamblers in terms of developing safer gambling tools, and all the responsible gambling tools that we've got now can actually help us, but it can also help us inform the debates on how we can actually measure problem gambling. And last thing I'll say on this, and this is one of my big bugbears, is because when people use the word problem gambling, particularly when you hear that in the media, is the media turn problem gambling into gambling addiction. And we have to be very clear here, is that problem gambling and gambling addiction are effectively two different things, or at least they're on a, you know, they're on a continuum. You know, all gambling addicts are problem gamblers, but not all problem gamblers are gambling addicts. And that's, you know, from, you know, in terms of how this is reported in the media, for me, this is why we do need to decide and define what these terms are in the first place.
Okay, thank you. David, interested in your view on this, but also, I mean, is there any hope, or do you think it'd even be a good idea to try and push for something in the EU where there's sort of a framework, at least for doing things across jurisdictions, to report and measure gambling harm in a more uniform way, or is that unrealistic?
That's a big question. First off, I think one problem with the instruments that we have today is that they also seem to work slightly in slightly different way depending on what population you're looking at. So low risk populations versus high risk populations, and also as Mark was saying, different types of gambling function in a different way, and I think needs special items in order to understand if the gambling associated with the particular gambling type is associated with harm or not. Of course, it would be a brilliant thing to have a set of standards for problem gambling or measuring problem gambling in the EU, but from my perspective, I think it's hard to agree on that. Also from the perspective that there's such a big difference between the populations.
Thank you. Sally, interested in your perspective on this idea of academic consistency, but also from a more clinical perspective. I mean, how practically important is it to you that various academics and institutions agree, or, you know, functionally speaking, is it better to just kind of, yeah, I mean, from a practical perspective, is there a certain amount to which you just need to sort of get on with it and not worry too much about everyone lining up?
Yeah, it's a good point to think about the practical importance of what it actually means for the individual. I think Mark was making that point of defining the behavior and the person. These are not the same thing. It's really important to think about the consumer who's involved in the problem or the development of harm. And for me, I think the key issue with all this talk about problem gambling and harms and defining and definitions is it's not very helpful in terms of the stigma. We know that there's a lot of stigma around mental health and that gambling itself is not very stigmatized in most cultures. It's quite an acceptable recreational entertainment activity, but problem gambling is highly stigmatized, much more so than many other mental health disorders. While we're starting to see a shift in recognition and concern and the destigmatization of some mental health conditions, behaviors like addiction and gambling problems still are perceived to be quite the fault of the individuals or something wrong with the person themselves. So with all the carry on about gambling problems, we're missing a huge portion of the population who will never identify with those terms. The more we engage with that kind of language is not helpful. What we need to do is start thinking more from a protection or I guess just safety point of view, similar to when you're learning to drive a car, you need a license, you put a seatbelt on, or thinking about how we've changed our approach to tobacco and smoking. It's taking generations, but it's now there are understandings about harm and safeguards that people automatically engage in. I think it's important to start looking at the people who have severe harms is a critical group, but thinking much more broadly about how next generations are going to engage in gambling. As Mark says, there's now technology that makes a lot of these protection behaviors much easier, more automated. We can provide better information about safeguards, about what is appropriate. And if we can start to normalize engagement with safer practices as people are beginning their gambling journey, we can start to shift the notion of what it means to try and reduce some of those harms without getting caught up into, well, only when you have a problem do you need to engage with X, Y, and Z.
Thank you. Mark, I'm going to come back to you on the subject of surveys. You've already spoken a little bit about issues with the way that surveys are conducted sometimes, but also the possibilities created by technology. If you had to pick out some ideas for best practice, there are a number of regulators who'll be watching this. I mean, what are the things you'd suggest that regulators and other institutions do to try and get reliable data?
You've mentioned the word reliability there, okay, and then this is why, again, I'll go right back to what I was saying in my opening remarks, is that there is a fundamental difference between what we might say is the subjective survey type research and, if you like, objective data that comes from player cards or online behavioral tracking. As a regulator, regulators, they can actually demand to see the data that companies have got. And of course, here in the UK, for instance, the Gambling Commission, do want to know how the big data is being used to help and intervene for people who may be developing problems. I mean, one of the issues now is, Sally's already mentioned this, is in terms of the harms that people have from gambling. You look at the Gambling Commission's definition of a harm, and a harm can be everything from, I'm having a bad day today, I'm feeling a little bit down, and if you're feeling a little bit down, you shouldn't be gambling when you're feeling a little bit blue and depressed that day, through to much more serious harms. It's very hard for operators to put themselves inside the head of a gambler, particularly when that gambler is on a terminal that you can't actually physically see somebody. In an offline situation, when somebody has been there in front of you for 8 hours in a casino, you can actually see what the person is doing there. It's actually, we have to infer a lot of things that go on in line, but we do have that data to intervene. In terms of your question of reliability is very hard to do across jurisdictions or even within jurisdictions. I mean, I'm somebody now as I get older now, I do like things to be evidence-based. And one of the problems that we've got, particularly in this area, is that, you know, regulators will often demand that companies do something, and in fact there's not the evidence there to say whether something is right to do in the first place. It might seem like a good idea on paper, okay, but in actuality, you know, it might not work at all. And this is what, you know, one of the things I've been doing, particularly over the last 10 years, is obviously to evaluate whether responsible gambling tools, these safer gambling tools actually work or not. You know, we had I mean, Sally could probably either back me up or disagree with me here. If we take something like pop-ups, okay, you know, there was a lot of research done on the effectiveness of whether pop-ups work or not in terms of reminding gamblers how much they're spending, what they're doing. Now, in a laboratory situation, we did a systematic review and meta-analysis recently on pop-up research, which basically said is that pop-ups are effective. But these were mostly done in the laboratory situation. They're not done necessarily with real gamblers. And you know, the sample sizes are very small. Myself and Michael Howe, we did 2 studies looking at pop-ups. With one study was with 50,000 online gamblers, another one with 70,000 online gamblers. And what we found in those situations is actually pop-ups were not very effective at all. So, you know, companies were spending millions of pounds introducing responsible gambling tools, yet the evidence isn't necessarily there. And I do think we need to be evidence-based when we're putting in the measures, obviously to help stop people developing problem gambling in the first place. Right. The issue that we have at the moment, and this goes back to what Margaret was saying, is that when people are developing regulations, most of it is based on survey-based research, you know, and most of the survey-based research, I mean, I'm not saying it's all unreliable, because obviously I do think people do try to answer honestly, but we know if you ask me how much have I gambled in the last year, I'm probably going to be fairly accurate, okay, because I'm not a big gambler. When somebody is gambling 3 or 4 times a week and you ask them how much are you spending, you're going to get very unreliable data, and we know that from, you know, where we've actually matched up our survey data with the actual objective tracking data. Basically, the more of a gambler that you are, and the more regular you are, and certainly more problematic you are, the more unreliable you are in terms of actually being able to assess your own behavior. Yet, all of the kind of regulations and policies that we have are often based on these national survey-based studies, which, you know, and to be honest, you know, people just concentrate immediately on that very small percentage of problem gamblers. You know, the whole of policy seems to depend on what this small group are saying. Yet we know, because of comparing objective data with subjective data, that data is very unreliable to start with. So there's no easy answers here, but we do have to learn from best practice. And, you know, when we get one country that's done something and, you know, they've got something that seems to work amongst their clientele and their population, then obviously we should be spreading that out elsewhere. We have learned a lot in the last.
If I could pick up on that, Mark, and hand this over to Margaret at this point.
Yeah.
You've obviously looked at a lot of surveys that countries have done. So I mean, are there examples of best practice in the that you've seen that other countries could adopt, that the kind of thing Mark's talking about?
Sorry, Joe, that was question still for Mark, right?
That was for you, Margaret. Yeah, what kind of best practices have you seen among the surveys that you've been looking at for your research?
I think, to reiterate what I've already said, my project wasn't intended to identify best practice. Sure. Because this is one thing that it's more of a subjective judgment value as to what we consider that works or doesn't work. And I wouldn't want to necessarily identify anything specific. What I would say is that I quite strongly agree with what Mark is saying, that in many ways surveys are already a little bit out of date because the technology has advanced so dramatically that we really should be harnessing it perhaps significantly more than we currently do to get the accurate data rather than self-recall, which inherently on many occasions is prone to being inaccurate. Being a lawyer, on the other hand, I'm very conscious of issues like surrounding data protection and protecting the customers, making sure that the tracking is used for the right purposes and for nothing else. And those are very complicated issues in order to overcome. which is why I think that while surveys have flaws, they still continue to be a useful tool, and perhaps having them on a regular intervals, that it's relatively consistent within individual jurisdictions, but also between different jurisdictions. And when there are specific major measures introduced in response to the particular data or particular responses, then it is evaluated without changes in the methodology, without changes into the way it is collected. So we can actually get not necessarily the most accurate, but at least broad evidence that would support decision making. But as I said, because it was more a fact-finding exercise as to what is actually happening rather than evaluating what is good and what is not, I wouldn't want to go into saying that particular screening tool is better than others or particular intervals is more suitable than others, because it all varies. And all screening tools have certain purposes that would be more accurate in certain settings than in others.
Okay, thank you. We'll move on from that subject, as we've got a lot we potentially still cover. Seen some questions coming in, which is fantastic. If you've got some things you'd like to know, please type them in, and I'll get to those very shortly. Sally, I'm interested in what you think the understanding of, you've talked a lot about the kind of larger at-risk group that exists out there, as well as those that might be pathologically defined as having a gambling problem. Do you think there's a sufficiently good understanding of that group of players?
No, definitely not. It's very difficult to define and study a group who don't identify with anything in particular. So it's a bit of a chasing the tail. For example, from a clinical point of view, if we think about how do we design interventions for this group is characterized by not having a problem. That's what's specific about them. They might be at risk, they may be experiencing some low level of harm, or be on what we might describe as a trajectory towards increasing severity of harm, but they don't necessarily identify as having a problem because they don't yet at this stage. So it's a difficult group to try and capture, because we can't be presumptuous and look at the fact that they are experiencing some low level of harm and make that judgment for them. So it's a tricky situation. Part of that will be about having an education for a broader group of the population of people who are on there, have some what we might have sort of risk indicators that we know are more likely to come in and be experienced of people who are at risk. And some of the work that Mark is talking about is really helpful. If we can look at people who end up at a severe gambling problem and work backwards and look at their trajectory, although it's difficult because some people have a very fast trajectory, some people have a slower trajectory, but we can start to get some indications of what is in common with these groups at the earlier stages before they escalate to a severe problem. And then if we can start to have some education and change the thinking around of these people to start identifying that it's these tools to engage with them is not only for people with gambling problems, but similarly to putting a seatbelt on, everyone should do this. So it might become a group we don't have to define necessarily if we are successful in destigmatizing engagement with appropriate prevention tools, such that if everyone's at a deposit limit, then that's covering a really broad base. It's not only sort of a target risk of at-risk people who need to set a deposit limit, it's all customers. So if we can be successful in increasing the threshold for engagement in safer gambling practices, to put safeguards in place for people to start thinking about what's an appropriate amount to spend, these sorts of things, obviously bespoke to the specific type of gambling, then we can potentially study people more, but also just provide a bit more of a buffer before then we focus only again on the people with more severe harms that need stronger and potentially less voluntary levels of intervention.
Thank you. It's very interesting. David, I know you've done some work, I believe, on demographics, understanding risks among demographics. I mean, could you talk a little bit about that? And also, I mean, is that sort of thing helpful to try and understand who's in that kind of broader at-risk cohort that, as Sally said, is quite difficult to gauge?
Sure. If you look at Swedish studies, they found that men between the age of 18 to 25 with low socioeconomic status are at risk, and also women between the age of 45 to 55 are at risk as well. And these men gamble to get the excitement of gambling, while the women in the older age group gamble to try to escape negative emotions. So these are two important risk groups to focus at when you look at at-risk gambling and at-risk gambling that can be developed into problem gambling. So I would say that those are some of the main risk groups that you could focus on when doing preventive efforts, for example.
Do you think that that's the sort of thing operators should do? Take that that knowledge, and if they're thinking about where to focus their efforts around the kind of wear your seatbelt advice that Sally was talking about, they should focus on those groups initially?
Well, yes and no. It's a really hard question to answer, and I agree with what Sally said about at-risk gamblers being a heterogeneous group. So from my experience and the studies that's been carried out in Sweden, an extra focus on these groups would be useful, but as Sally was saying as well, I think that the individual trajectories are really different, and it's hard to have a solution that will work for everyone. But if you could have a small RG sort of education for gamblers starting at a gambling site that would educate them in responsible gambling and try to make that compulsory, that could be sort of one way of reaching these gamblers, for example.
Okay, we've had a question come in about language and destigmatization. I know there's a particular debate and a difference of the use of language around things like problem gambler and gambling harm and so forth. I mean, the question is about how important the panel thinks the terminology that we use is. Anyone have a thought on that immediately?
I think it's very important. The term problem gambling is stigmatizing. It implies that there is something about that individual that is problematic. And as opposed to thinking about it as a behavior, we know that gambling disorder, if you want to look at a clinical definition, is very cyclical. People tend to cycle in and out of risk categories over time. We don't typically see a stable trajectory of risk. Many people may experience risk at one point in time and then go to become a non-risky player or have periods of relapse and recovery. So using terms like problem gambler implies that individual has something wrong with them, and that's a stable characteristic of that person, rather referring to the behavior that can change over time, and that it also takes away the responsibility of other factors impacting the likelihood of that person. So there are clunkier ways of talking about things, but be more respectful of the group we are trying to reduce and intervene and prevent experiencing that harm, I think is quite important to start thinking about the impact of the language that we do use. And terms like responsible gambling have lost any meaning. They've become synonymous with problem gambling. So if we want to start thinking about changing perspectives, we need to start thinking about changing the language as well and taking that seriously.
Okay, my perspective, I pretty much agree with what Sally's saying, Joe. I mean, any of us that submit papers to journals now, not just on gambling, but anything, you get the reviewers' comments coming back saying, please, can you make your language more person-centered, meaning you don't say problem gambler, you have to talk about an individual with a gambling problem or an individual with a substance use problem. Now, from my perspective, I agree totally with what Sally's saying in terms of, these terms can be stigmatizing for the person. But when you're with a journal, for instance, who's got a 3,000 word limit, having a person with a gambling problem, which is 5 words, and problem gambler, which is 2 words, often you're finding yourself having to use what is stigmatizing language so you can fit into the word limits of a journal. You know, and that's just the harsh reality of academic publishing, unfortunately, is that space is at a premium. But totally agree with what Sally is saying, is that for a lot of people, these terms are stigmatizing, and we as academics, when we report it, have to be more person-centered in terms, and it's not just about gambling, it's in terms of everything we look at now.
And yes, also a short note is that the words we use will also influence how significant others, for example, view their partner or friend or the individual that gamblers as well. So it's about what we communicate to them as well, and to others around them, which I think is important. So I totally agree with Sally on this point.
Thank you very much. So there's a market for a snappier term we've come up with. I think that's one takeaway there. That might be an easier thing to solve. We had a question come in on deposit limits, on whether mandatory deposit limits are useful in terms of limiting gambling harm. The questioner also asked whether behavioural limits, they give the example of maybe setting a limit on the number of deposits you can make per month, would be more useful in terms of limiting harm across the whole financial spectrum. Anyone have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I've got lots of thoughts on it, Joe.
I thought you might. Go ahead.
No, I mean, you know, myself and Michael Hour, I think we've now done 7 studies on limit setting, obviously using big data with real gamblers, with real sites in real time. Our research tends to suggest that limit setting does work. And the question about mandatory versus voluntary, I'm personally in favour of a mandatory system. You know, Norway have gone to a mandatory system now, and the evidence does seem to suggest that a mandatory limit setting does help those who need it most, which are those who are spending the most time and the most money on gambling. I mean, you can type my name in on Mark Griffith's limit setting, and you can come up with all the research that we've done. There's been a good review recently by Paul Dalfaber and Daniel King, looked at about 25 different limit setting studies, and again, they pretty much, even though the evidence is sketchy, I do think it actually has more positives than negatives.
Thank you. Any other thoughts on deposit limits?
Just that the design of deposit limits is important. As Mark says, it seems the evidence supports that they are effective. I'd say probably one of the more effective tools, or at least the most researched tool. And where they're not mandatory, certainly something like a default to opt out rather than to opt in. So the more nudges, the less friction. But also I think it's important to educate people onto what is an appropriate limit. So the behavioural insights team in the UK have done research suggesting not having anchors, so just having a blank box so people type in and certainly not suggesting anything high. So if there is an anchor, put it quite low to encourage normalising, placing low level limits. But the way you design the limits, people will get around things. So if you put a limit on how many limits you can have, or when you do mandate things that people just tend to alter their behavior, people will get around it. But if we can start to set up the design of sites to normalize engagement and encourage people to set safer gambling limits, there's some recent research suggesting, you know, you should gamble less than 1% of your income, or, you know, that might be too low for some people. But again, if we can start to anchor and educate people about what is recommended, that's going to be more useful, because just expecting, you know, I've provided this tool and people could choose to use it and people can choose to use it in an appropriate way, it's not sufficient. We need to do more to encourage people and to assist people into gambling in appropriate ways.
All right, thank you very much. We're coming rapidly, sadly, to a close. So before we do, just a quick fire closing question. If you could pick one measure that would you think most contribute to a better understanding of problem gambling, what would it be? I'll start with Margaret.
I would say tracking actual behavior of the players.
Very good. Mark?
It's got to be the gambling industry opening up their data sets to allow researchers to work with. I've always said the gambling industry have the best quality data. It needs to be more open and transparent for everybody to use.
David?
I agree with Mark, using and Margaret, using tracking data from gambling companies. Yes.
Sally?
And I'm pretty much on board with that too. Collaboration, but I would say as well as tracking data, we're actually looking at collaboration in terms of testing interventions, testing policy, using the data to do manipulations and testing to see what works.
Wonderful. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you all of those who've been watching and listening. As a small note, if you're a Gambling Compliance subscriber, if you're signed up to this webinar, you should get information about a free piece of e-learning, a CPD accredited course on player protection and safer gambling that will go out to everyone, something we're doing as part of Safer Gambling Week. So look out for that. Just again, say thank you so much to the panelists. Really interesting discussion. I hope those of you listening found it useful, and have a lovely day. See you soon.